So over the past 3 weeks, we've covered a lot of really important ground in Boone's new mission statement. The first week we discussed who we are, a safe space for all, what we believe, that Christ commands us to love, and then last week what we do. We create change through worship, learning, and service. All of these are the sorts of things that define us as a community. They're the sorts of things that someone looking for a new church home might be curious about. But as informative as all this is, it's also important for us to recognize the goals that we aren't quite achieving yet, to name the aspirational aspects of our mission, what we want to keep working towards. And so the last part of the ABCs of Boone outlines what we, as a community, dream of being and doing. At Boone, we dream of being a home for the lonely and reaching out to all who are looking for a place to belong. While we self-identify as a safe space in the very beginning of our new mission statement, this final section recognizes that there's still more we can do. There's further that we can go. It acknowledges that we're still not done working towards God's kingdom. If we want to answer God's call to deep transformation of hearts and lives, as we said we did last week, we not only have to be a safe space for all, but we also need to work towards being a home for all. Now, while these two feelings are related, pretty closely related, I think we can all agree that a sense of safety and a sense of home are two very different things. Back when Nick and I, my husband and I, were first discussing the possibility of moving in together, I felt strongly that I didn't want to move into his apartment. It certainly wasn't because I didn't feel safe there. I did. It was actually in a much nicer part of town than my apartment was, and I obviously trusted him. The reason I didn't want to move into his place is because no matter how safe I might have felt there, it wasn't my home. It was his. I knew that it would take a lot of work and time to make it feel like home to me. Even with the best of intentions on his part, I'd still need to figure out how to fit myself into the home that he had already created. I'd have to find literal space for my clothes, my books, my toothbrush, and even my dog within a pre-existing organizational system set up for one person. I'd need to disrupt his settled patterns of life in order to make room for mine. If, on the other hand, we both moved into an entirely new place, we'd be doing the same work at the same time to make it a home together. Neither of us would have a claim to seniority, and both of us would have equal say in how the new home would work. Those of us who have felt at home with God for years or even decades, we tend not to realize exactly how much our church community reflects our own spiritual needs and preferences. Our home is already established, but we expect other people who join us to make their sense of home fit around ours. We surround ourselves with objects and traditions that we find comforting. We create house rules that make sense to us, and we never really consider alternatives to our way of being the church. Of course, others are welcome to visit, to admire what we've done with the place, and even to participate in our home life. But the unspoken assumption is that it has to be on our terms. At least some of that has to do with this passage from John's Gospel. We usually hear it outside of its surrounding context. And John 14, verse 2 is often translated as something like, "My Father's house has many rooms." Right? Who's heard that version before? Many rooms. Right, yeah. Without the larger setting of this text, we tend to subconsciously apply our own frame of reference in an effort to make sense out of it. Now, I don't know what your father's house was like when you were a kid, but no matter how many rooms were in my father's and mother's house, it was definitely a finite number. We didn't keep extra rooms empty just in case. My parents bought a house based on the needs of their immediate family, the four of us. From the perspective of this frame of reference, it's easy for us to hear Jesus' speech here as being directed towards just his immediate family, being a message just for us. Don't worry, each of you kids will get your own room, and you can even have friends over to visit once in a while. Even recognizing that this house in this passage is a metaphor, right, referring more to a relationship than to a physical location, we derive a sense of personal ownership when we hear the passage this way. We are the ones with the right to feel at home because we are the ones for whom the house was built. Everyone else is a guest, an afterthought. A beloved afterthought, but an afterthought nonetheless. But believe it or not, John didn't have your childhood home or mine in mind when he wrote this gospel. If we step back to take a broader view of John, we don't see a pattern of putting me first, but rather one of self-sacrifice. Just before today's reading, if you back up by one chapter to chapter 13, Jesus washes his disciples' feet, and he gives them a new commandment: to love each other the way he loved them. Then immediately after he finishes talking in chapter 16, it's a long speech, he leaves to face death for the sake of others. And later on in John's gospel, in the last chapter, in a post-resurrection encounter, Jesus instructs Peter, "If you love me, feed my sheep." And these are just the events in the last part of the gospel. Jesus is obviously far more concerned with others than with himself. And he makes it clear that he expects his disciples to follow his example. In light of all this, it seems to me that describing God's house as having many rooms is probably an understatement. Given Jesus' emphasis on care for others and his commandment, not just his teaching, but his commandment that we do the same, it seems virtually impossible that my Father's house would be meant only as Jesus' inner circle. Maybe they would be the first to find it, but they were never intended to be the last. In my opinion, the CEB conveys this better than other translations. It says there's room to spare, not just plenty for us, but more than enough for everyone. You can bring your friends home with you, and they can move right in. Yes, it's your home, but it's meant to be their home too. As those who are here first, We can't faithfully declare the things that make us comfortable as the church's default. Just because we've been doing it for centuries doesn't mean that's the right way. We may already feel at home here, but at the end of the day, it's God's house, right? And Jesus says there's metaphorical room to spare. It's our responsibility to make sure that others don't have to tiptoe around our sense of home in order to find their own. We don't have the option of moving into a brand new space together every time we welcome new members, nor do I think we'd want to. But what that means is that it'll just take more deliberate work to make sure that everyone walking through the doors of this building shares the sense of comfort and belonging that we each cherish. And it's not their responsibility to do this work. It's ours. The work isn't just done just by opening the door to newcomers. That's not enough. We can't just speak words of welcome and assume that that's enough. It's not good enough to offer a separate space for others to make their home that's out of the way for us. Maybe an earlier worship service or that empty pew at the front that nobody actually wants to sit in. It can't be their home if it's on our terms. It only counts if we step back to make room for their desires, their preferences, their needs, their way of encountering God, even if they appear to conflict with ours. Ideally, we would do this before they even ask us to, but at the very least, as soon as we become aware of them. Now, I'm fortunate that while Nick didn't quite understand what I was getting at, why I wanted to start our shared household from scratch, because he's a very logical guy and it sure would be easier to just stay in one place. But he was willing to go along with it because it was so important to me. And although I didn't realize it at the time, his cooperation has had a far-reaching impact on our relationship. He clearly communicated his love to me in a way that's been hard to forget over the years through this choice. Of course, we've had plenty of arguments since then, but none of them have been able to upset the unshakable foundation of love on which our shared household was built. When we demonstrate that someone else's sense of belonging matters just as much to us as our own, we're telling them simply but powerfully that we love them. Even if we don't get it, even if we're perfectly comfortable the way things are, even if it's easier to leave well enough alone, the moment that we go out of our way to accommodate another person, the moment we let them know that this is their home as much as ours, is the moment that they know beyond doubt that we love them. That's what Jesus spent his whole life, death, and resurrection trying to show us, and the very last teaching that he gave to his disciples. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. No matter what anyone else may try to tell you, keeping Christ's commandments is and always has been about love. Loving others is directly connected to loving Jesus. And loving Jesus is directly tied to a relationship with God. So it turns out that our own sense of home, not just a space that we feel comfortable, but real home, eternal home, home in a deep spiritual sense? Well, that actually relies on the work that we do to create home for others. It's all connected. Loving others in this way requires paying close attention to who's missing and why that might be, asking questions and listening humbly to the answers, and taking a chance on new, possibly uncomfortable things. It requires a reframing of our perspective, a reimagining of what church is and should be, and a level of outreach that the church hasn't historically had to do before. Because these days, people don't avoid church because they don't know about Jesus. Everyone knows about Jesus. They avoid church because they're afraid that it won't be anything like him. So if we really do dream of being a home for the lonely and reaching out to all who are looking for a place to belong, then we have to figure out how to change this decades-long narrative, starting with our own assumptions and habits. God's house does indeed have room to spare. So maybe it's time for those of us who've been around the longest to stop taking up so much of it. Besides, if we let someone else make our home into theirs, we could learn a new way of encountering God that we'd never thought of before. That's the beauty of sharing a home with another person. The chance to build something better together than you ever could on your own. Spoiler alert, that's what wound up happening for me and Nick. And I imagine for many of you with your partners or spouses. I can only imagine what will happen when Christ's church finally figures this out. At least we can try to do our part, together with those here now and anticipating those to come. Let's build a home not just for some, but for all, exactly the way that Jesus envisioned it. Amen.